Burkina Faso just signed a deal that breaks every rule the West wrote, and three of the world's most isolated powers are betting everything on it working. North Korea is trading weapons for farmland. Russia is arming militias the UN won't recognize. China is building roads that don't appear on any development map. And Captain Ibrahim Traoré? He's not asking for permission anymore. This isn't another failed state. This is a controlled demolition of a global order, happening in real time, in a country most people can't find on a map. If this works, the entire power structure that's governed the world since 1945 doesn't just crack, it shatters. And the countdown has already started. On March 4, 2025, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before a packed assembly in Ouagadougou and declared what many feared to say out loud. Burkina Faso is fighting two wars at once, and only one of them involves guns. The first war is visible. It's brutal, chaotic, and unforgiving. Across the northern and eastern regions of Burkina Faso, jihadist factions affiliated with Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State have turned entire provinces into conflict zones. Villages are razed. Schools shut down. Convoys are ambushed on dirt roads that no longer guarantee safe passage. Since 2015, over 2 million people have been displaced. Thousands have died. The insurgency doesn't just challenge the state. It questions whether the state can even exist in those areas. This is the war the world sees. But Traoré insists there's a second front. One that operates through diplomatic channels, financial pressure, and the quiet withdrawal of support. After Burkina Faso expelled French troops in early 2023 and exited regional defense pacts tied to Paris, the consequences were swift. Military aid slowed. Intelligence sharing evaporated. European Union funding for counterterrorism, once a lifeline, began drying up. What was once framed as partnership now feels, to Ouagadougou, like punishment. Traoré's government argues that sovereignty came with a price tag, and the West is making them pay it. This is where the stakes become clear. Burkina Faso isn't just severing old alliances, it's attempting to survive without them in one of the most dangerous regions on Earth. The Sahel has become a graveyard for state authority. Mali fractured. Niger pivoted toward Moscow. Chad remains militarized and tense. Burkina Faso, landlocked and resource-strained, now finds itself navigating insurgency while simultaneously resisting what it perceives as external sabotage disguised as concern. France, for its part, denies orchestrating isolation. Paris insists that its troop withdrawal was a response to hostile rhetoric and deteriorating bilateral relations, not a geopolitical punishment. European officials echo this line, framing reduced engagement as a natural consequence of Burkina Faso's pivot toward Russia and its growing reliance on private military contractors like the Wagner Group. From their perspective, Traoré made a choice. Choices have costs. But in Ouagadougou, the narrative is different. The government sees a pattern. Vocal African leaders who challenge French influence face destabilization, sanctions, coup, media campaigns questioning their legitimacy. Traoré's supporters point to decades of French military presence in the Sahel that failed to stop jihadist expansion, arguing that Operation Barkhane and its successors were never truly about African security. They were about maintaining influence. Now that Burkina Faso has refused to play along, the gloves are off. What happens next could redefine the region. Traoré has doubled down. He's expanded recruitment into local militias known as volunteers for the defense of the homeland, arming civilians to fight alongside overstretched military forces. He's courted Russia, receiving equipment and trainers in exchange for strategic alignment. He's tightened his grip domestically, suspending certain civil liberties under the rationale of national emergency. His supporters call it pragmatism. His critics call it authoritarianism dressed in anti-colonial rhetoric. The international community watches with unease. If Burkina Faso collapses, jihadist networks gain another stronghold. If it survives on Russian backing, Western influence in West Africa contracts further. Either outcome reshapes the region's power map. Meanwhile, ordinary Burkinabe are caught between state mobilization and insurgent violence, their futures determined by forces they cannot control. Traore frames his struggle as existential, not just against terrorism, but against a global order that punishes defiance. Whether that framing is accurate or convenient is almost irrelevant now. It's become the foundation of his legitimacy. He's betting that Burkina Faso can outlast the isolation, that sovereignty is worth the cost, and that history will remember him as the leader who refused to bow. But wars on two fronts are notoriously hard to win, especially when one enemy hides in the desert and the other operates from conference rooms in Brussels and boardrooms in Paris. The question isn't whether Burkina Faso is under pressure. It's whether that pressure will forge resilience or break the state entirely. Burkina Faso is running out of ammunition faster than it can secure supply lines, and that reality is quietly reshaping who holds influence across West Africa. In the span of 18 months, the Burkinabe military has tripled its operational tempo. Convoys push deeper into insurgent-held territory. Air assets fly daily reconnaissance missions over the Sahel's unforgiving terrain. Ground forces, backed by hastily trained civilian militias, engage jihadi cells in skirmishes that drain resources at an unsustainable rate. Every firefight burns through stockpiles. Every ambush demands medical supplies, fuel, and replacements for destroyed equipment. The math is simple and unforgiving. Burkina Faso's military infrastructure cannot sustain a protracted counterinsurgency alone, not without external support, and not from the partners it once relied on. France pulled its troops. The European Union scaled back military assistance. Washington watches from a distance, reluctant to deepen involvement in a region where coups have become routine and anti-Western sentiment is rising. For Captain Ibrahim Traoré's government, this isn't just a logistical challenge. It's an existential vulnerability. A military stretched thin, undersupplied, and facing enemies on multiple fronts is a military on the edge of collapse. Which is why Ouagadougou turned east. Russia arrived first, not with press conferences or diplomatic fanfare, but with cargo planes carrying small arms, ammunition, and armored vehicles. Reports indicate that military trainers, likely affiliated with private contractors, have been operating in country since late 2023. Moscow's approach is transactional and discreet. No demands for democratic reforms. No lectures on governance. Just hardware, expertise, and a willingness to engage where others withdrew. For Burkina Faso, this pragmatism is precisely the point. Traoré's government frames the relationship not as dependence, but as diversification, a necessary pivot when traditional allies made sovereignty conditional. China's involvement is quieter, but no less significant. Beijing has provided drones, communication equipment, and infrastructure support that enhances military mobility. Unlike Russia's more visible military footprint, China's engagement blends security assistance with economic investment, offering a dual-use framework that strengthens state capacity without overt militarization. Chinese-built roads improve troop movement. Surveillance technology aids intelligence gathering. The lines between development and defense blur intentionally. This is where the stakes become clear. Eastern powers aren't just filling a gap, they're positioning themselves as indispensable. What happens next could redefine the region. Burkina Faso's reliance on Russian and Chinese support sends a signal across the Sahel. Mali has already embraced Moscow. Niger's junta expelled French forces and invited Russian trainers. A pattern is emerging. African governments that challenge Western influence are finding alternative patrons willing to provide security assistance without the political baggage. For Moscow and Beijing, this is a low-cost, high-reward strategy. They gain footholds in a resource-rich region, fracture Western cohesion, and present themselves as partners rather than lecturers. But dependence carries risks, even when framed as partnership. Russian military support comes with strings that aren't always visible up front. Access to strategic resources, diplomatic alignment at the United Nations, tolerance for the presence of contractors whose accountability is murky at best. China, meanwhile, accumulates leverage through infrastructure debt and technology dependence. Ouagadougou may be avoiding one form of control, but it's arguably trading it for another, one that operates differently but binds just as tightly over time. Western powers are not oblivious to this shift. Behind closed doors, there's growing concern that the Sahel is slipping beyond their strategic reach. France lost its military footprint. The United States struggles to justify engagement in a region increasingly hostile to its presence. The European Union's leverage has evaporated. Meanwhile, Russia and China operate with fewer constraints and longer timelines, willing to accept instability as long as influence grows. The question isn't whether Burkina Faso needs external military support. It clearly does. The question is what that support ultimately costs. Traore insists his government is navigating pragmatically, taking assistance where it's offered without surrendering sovereignty. But pragmatism and dependence are separated by a thin line, and that line becomes harder to see with every shipment of weapons, every training program, every infrastructure project tied to a strategic alignment. Burkina Faso's survival may depend on Eastern support today. Whether that support allows genuine independence tomorrow remains the central uncertainty, one that will shape not just Burkina Faso's future, but the entire balance of power across the Sahel. North Korea just offered Burkina Faso $120 million in military aid, and the price isn't paid in cash. In a geopolitical landscape already crowded with Russian contractors and Chinese infrastructure deals, Pyongyang's emergence as a potential arms supplier to one of West Africa's most embattled states marks a dramatic expansion of North Korea's global reach. The proposal, reportedly delivered through back-channel diplomatic contacts in late 2024, is straightforward in its transactional logic. Burkina Faso receives weapons, fuel, ammunition, and air defense systems. In return, North Korea gains access to agricultural land for food production and extraction rights to mineral deposits, including limestone and manganese. No currency changes hands. No international financial systems are involved. Just resources for hardware, state to state, beyond the scrutiny of Western sanctions architecture. For Captain Ibrahim Traoré's government, the appeal is immediate. Burkina Faso's military is hemorrhaging supplies faster than traditional or even newer partners can replenish them. Russian and Chinese support has helped, but gaps remain, particularly in air defense and sustained logistical capacity. North Korea, despite its isolation, maintains a massive domestic arms industry built precisely to operate outside global norms. Pyongyang produces artillery, small arms, rockets, and older but functional defense systems that don't require integration with Western or even modern Russian platforms. For a country fighting an insurgency with whatever works, North Korean equipment offers an unglamorous but practical solution. This is where the stakes become clear. North Korea's involvement isn't about ideology or alliance. It's about survival economics on both sides. Pyongyang faces chronic food insecurity and needs reliable agricultural output beyond its borders. Its mineral resources are limited, and its economy is suffocated by international sanctions. Burkina Faso, meanwhile, sits on underexploited deposits of manganese and limestone, materials useful in steel production and construction, both critical to North Korea's industrial base. The deal essentially bypasses the global financial system entirely, operating through barter and long-term resource access agreements that are nearly impossible for external actors to disrupt. What happens next could redefine the region. If this arrangement materializes, it sets a precedent. Sanctioned states trading directly with resource-rich but militarily vulnerable African nations creates a parallel economy that functions entirely outside Western influence. North Korea has already employed similar strategies in Africa before, selling arms to Eritrea, providing military training in Uganda and Zimbabwe, and engaging in construction and mineral extraction deals across the continent during the Cold War and beyond. But this would be different in scale and visibility. Burkina Faso is not a peripheral actor. It's at the center of a broader Sahel crisis that involves French withdrawal, jihadist expansion, and a realignment of regional power structures. Western intelligence agencies are reportedly aware of the discussions, but options for intervention are limited. Sanctioning Burkina Faso would only deepen its isolation and push it further toward alternative partnerships. Diplomatic pressure has already failed to reverse Traoré's pivot away from France and Europe. Militarily, there's no appetite for intervention. The result is a strategic vacuum where North Korea, of all actors, finds an opening. Pyongyang operates with fewer constraints than Beijing or Moscow. It doesn't care about international reputation. It doesn't need to justify its partnerships to allies. It simply offers what others won't, under terms others can't match. For Burkina Faso, the calculation is cold and pragmatic. Sovereignty requires security. Security requires weapons. Weapons require supply chains that don't collapse under political pressure. If North Korea can deliver, the source matters less than the outcome. Traoré's government frames this as diversification, not desperation, though the line between the two grows thinner with each new partnership. But barter deals carry hidden costs. Agricultural land offered today becomes entrenched foreign presence tomorrow. Mineral extraction rights signed under duress rarely favor the host nation long-term. And North Korea, despite its isolation, is not a passive partner. Pyongyang's engagements in Africa have historically included intelligence sharing, military training that extends beyond hardware, and the establishment of relationships that outlast individual transactions. Burkina Faso may gain the weapons it needs to survive the present crisis. Whether it retains control over the terms of that survival is the question that will define the next decade, not just for Ouagadougou, but for every other African state watching this precedent unfold. Burkina Faso has become a testing ground for something far larger than itself, a coordinated effort by Russia, China, and North Korea to dismantle Western dominance, one supply chain at a time. What's unfolding in Ouagadougou isn't just about military aid or resource deals. It's about demonstrating that an African state can survive, arm itself, and assert sovereignty entirely outside the structures that have governed global power since the end of World War II. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's government didn't set out to become a symbol, but by expelling French troops, rejecting European Union conditions, and turning eastward for weapons and support, Burkina Faso has become exactly that, a live case study in whether the Western-led order can be bypassed, challenged, and ultimately reshaped. The timing matters. Across the Sahel, a pattern has emerged. Mali expelled French forces and invited Russian contractors. Niger's junta severed military ties with Paris and opened channels with Moscow. Chad, long a pillar of French influence, has signaled frustration with traditional partnerships. Now Burkina Faso is negotiating with North Korea for arms in exchange for land and minerals. These aren't isolated decisions. They're part of a broader realignment where African governments, frustrated by decades of conditional aid and security partnerships that failed to deliver stability, are exploring alternatives. And Moscow, Beijing, and Pyongyang are ready to provide them. This is where the stakes become clear. Russia, China, and North Korea don't operate under the same constraints as Western powers. They don't attach governance reforms to military aid. They don't demand transparency in resource contracts. They don't lecture about democracy or human rights as prerequisites for engagement. For African leaders navigating insurgencies, coups, and fragile legitimacy, this flexibility is appealing. It allows them to secure what they need: weapons, infrastructure, economic investment, without the political costs that come with Western partnerships. From Moscow, Beijing, and Pyongyang's perspective, this is asymmetric leverage at scale. Every African state that pivots eastward weakens the West's ability to shape outcomes, enforce norms, or maintain access to critical resources. Burkina Faso exemplifies how this strategy functions in practice. Russia provides immediate military capacity through contractors and arms shipments. China builds infrastructure that enhances state control while creating long-term economic dependence. North Korea offers hardware and resource deals that circumvent sanctions entirely. Together, they create a supply ecosystem that doesn't rely on dollars, doesn't flow through Western banks, and doesn't require approval from Washington, Paris, or Brussels. It's a parallel system designed to function independently, and increasingly, it does. What happens next could redefine the global order. If Burkina Faso stabilizes using Eastern support, other African nations will take note. The model becomes replicable. If it collapses, Western powers can argue that sovereignty without their partnership leads to chaos. Either outcome reshapes how influence is projected across the global South. The broader implication extends beyond Africa. Russia's war in Ukraine demonstrated that sanctions, while painful, are survivable when alternative networks exist. China's Belt and Road Initiative has already created dependencies that rival Western financial institutions. North Korea's willingness to trade arms for resources shows that even the most isolated states can find partners when mutual interest aligns. Together, these actors represent a coordinated challenge to the post-Cold War consensus that Western institutions would remain the primary arbiters of global trade, security, and governance. Europe and the United States are aware of this shift, but responses remain fractured. France has lost its military footprint in the Sahel and struggles to articulate a compelling alternative vision. The European Union offers development aid but lacks the strategic flexibility to compete with Eastern pragmatism. Washington remains distracted by great power competition elsewhere and reluctant to deepen commitments in a region where anti-American sentiment is rising. Meanwhile, Moscow, Beijing, and Pyongyang move with fewer internal debates and longer timelines, willing to accept instability as long as influence expands. Burkina Faso didn't choose to become a focal point in this contest. But geography, timing, and desperation have placed it at the center of a question that will define the next era of international relations. Can the Western-led order adapt to a world where other powers offer viable alternatives? Or will it fracture under the weight of its own conditions? Traore's government is betting that sovereignty is worth the risk. The rest of the world is watching to see if that bet pays off, or if breaking from the West simply means trading one form of dependence for another, with fewer safeguards and longer consequences.